Right, so today we're diving deep into a topic that's been on everyone's mind. I mean, it's impossible to ignore, right?
Yeah, the war in Ukraine, definitely a heavy one.
For sure. And we're going beyond just the headlines here. Really trying to unpack some of the deeper issues using the sources you guys provided, of course.
Right, those sources. I mean, they really get into the tough question about fairness, political motivations, the real impact on people's lives, stuff that you don't always see in the news cycle.
Exactly. And speaking of tough questions, I mean, the first source comes right out and says, war in Ukraine is not fair.
Yeah.
Which, when you think about it, almost every war probably feels unfair to those involved.
Absolutely. But I think the source might be getting at something specific here. The sheer imbalance of power between Russia and Ukraine is kind of impossible to ignore.
Right. And it's not just about their militaries, although obviously there's a huge difference there.
Oh, yeah. It's about everything. Population, resources, even just the size of the countries. Ukraine's just massively outmatched.
Yeah, when you put it that way, it's a bit like David and Goliath, only with way, way higher stakes.
Absolutely. And speaking of high stakes.
Oh, right. The source also brings up those security
Yeah.
promises, right? Specifically, the ones related to nuclear weapons.
Oh, yeah, that adds a whole other layer of complexity to this whole thing. I mean, those security promises are really referring to the assurances that Ukraine got when it gave up its nuclear arsenal back in the 90s.
Right, like back when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Exactly. They were promised that their territorial integrity would be respected if they disarmed. And, well, now those promises seem like they weren't worth much.
And so now the potential for nuclear escalation is, well, it's terrifying.
It's like this dark cloud hanging over everything. You can see why world leaders are so hesitant to get directly involved.
Yeah, I mean, no one wants to trigger something even worse. And for the people in Ukraine, I can't even imagine what it's like to live with that constant threat hanging over your head.
Absolutely. It just adds another layer of fear on top of everything else they're dealing with. So we've talked about the global power dynamics, but the source also gets into some of the internal issues within Ukraine itself, like corruption and this thing they call bezification.
Yeah, busification. That's a word most people probably haven't heard before. What exactly does that even mean?
So imagine a system where the people in power can basically do whatever they want. There's no accountability.
It's familiar, unfortunately.
Yeah, sadly it is. But bezification takes it to another level. It's like a system of complete impunity. Rules are bent or ignored. Personal connections matter more than the law.
So you're saying it's a system that's basically built on sand?
Kind of, yeah. Trying to build a stable, functioning society on top of that is almost impossible. And we see this pattern in other conflicts, too. When you have this level of systemic corruption, it just makes everything harder.
Right. Governing effectively, addressing people's needs,
Hmm.
even just receiving and using aid effectively, it all becomes way more complicated.
Exactly. And that actually leads perfectly into another point from the source. They say, partners just give promises.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, why isn't international aid more effective? I mean, there seems to be a lot of global support for Ukraine, at least on paper.
Right, there is. But the problem is, delivering that aid during an active war, it's incredibly tough. There are logistical nightmares, safety concerns, obviously, and the constant threat of
It's
attacks.
not as simple as just writing a check or sending a shipment of supplies.
Not at all. And then you have the whole political dimension to consider. Every country involved has to weigh their own interests, right? And they have to worry about escalating the conflict even further. So even when the support is there, turning that into real, tangible results on the ground, that's a whole other challenge.
It really puts things in perspective. Even with good intentions, it's so hard to actually make a difference in a situation like this.
It really is.
And in the middle of all of this, you have all these ordinary people whose lives are just being completely upended. I mean, the source puts it pretty blunt when they say, your skills are nothing against drones or missiles.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement. It really highlights the human cost of this war.
And how modern warfare has changed everything.
Exactly. It's not about hand-to-hand combat anymore. It's about remote warfare, technology that allows you to attack from a distance. So suddenly, it doesn't matter what your education is or what your profession is or what you've accomplished in life. You're just completely vulnerable.
It's hard to think about. Now, the source also makes a pretty bold claim. They say, the end of the war will come by the decision of politicians and not the military. What do you mean to that?
Well, I think it's a reminder that wars aren't just about winning battles. It's
Yeah.
about achieving political goals. So, yeah, military victories can give you leverage, but in the end, it's going to be negotiations, treaties, political agreements that bring about any kind of lasting peace.
Right. I mean, if you look back at any major conflict throughout history, the decision to end the fighting and the terms of the peace, those are always determined by political leaders.
Exactly. Which makes you wonder about the true goals of those in power, right? I mean, this source goes on to say that the real aims of the war are resources and power, not denazification and demilitarization like we often hear.
So how should we be thinking about these conflicting narratives?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that every side in a conflict is going to use narratives and rhetoric to justify their actions.
Right.
So we have to be critical thinkers. We have to look beyond just the surface level explanations.
Look at the history, the economics, the geopolitical factors at play.
Exactly. Yes, there are definitely genuine security concerns involved here. But there are also underlying power dynamics, competition for resources, historical grievances that go back centuries. All of that is fueling this conflict.
And speaking of long-standing tensions, there's one final really pointed statement from this source that I wanted to touch on. They say, Ukraine never will be in NATO.
Mhm.
So why is this issue of NATO membership so central to this whole conflict?
Well, for Ukraine, joining NATO would be like getting a security blanket. It would mean that other NATO members are obligated to come to their defense if they were attacked. So for them, it's a way to deter future aggression. But Russia, well, they see NATO expansion as a threat.
Right, like NATO's creeping closer and closer to their borders.
Exactly. And this has been a major source of tension between Russia and the West for decades now.
And it's definitely a major factor in this current conflict, no question. So where does all of this leave us? I mean, after diving into all of this, what are the key takeaways?
Well, I think it's clear that this war is incredibly complex. There's this whole web of historical factors, political motivations, competing narratives, and trying to disentangle all of that, it's really challenging.
Absolutely. But in the middle of all of that, what we can't lose sight of is the human impact.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in all the political analysis and the strategy and all of that. But behind every headline, behind every statistic, there are real people whose lives are being shattered by this war. Their stories matter.
For sure. Understanding the human cost of this conflict is just as important as understanding the geopolitical complexities, maybe even more so.
Yeah, I think that's something important for everyone to remember, the individual lives that are affected by this. And maybe this is something we can all think about going forward, the long-term consequences of this war, not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for the entire world.
It's definitely a lot to consider, and as always, we appreciate you guys listening to this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
And be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us get the word out about these important conversations.
We'll see you next time.
See ya.